Hello again, Peter Galante here with
Cassandra Coop.
And now we're going to do a video that's talking about the principles of design. So basically we're going to go through some examples. All of these examples have been taken from the Smithsonian Institution. So some of them I know who the photographer is, some I don't. For example, this one I don't recall who the photographer is. But when you're looking at these images, I don't want you to sort of split hairs. I mean, the question is always, why did the photographer make the picture? What motivated the person to, in this case, stop the car, get out, and look at the horizon and align the camera the way it is? So the camera is right on the right side of the road, which is the center of the picture. And then you have this one-point perspective with the road and the fence line on the right converging almost dead center in the middle of the picture, and the horizon is cutting through the middle of the picture on the left-hand side. So the photographer looked out at the distance and said, wow, there's nothing out there. This is practically empty, and aligned the camera this way because they were using the principle of balance. I mean, yes, many photographs have multiple design principles, but the person set this up to be as balanced as they could in that case. Let's go to the next image. All right, zoom that up a little bit. Okay, so now we're looking at, some pyramids. So what is the first thing you see? You see several different kind of pyramids. They're different sizes. So what design principle is this? This is variety. Yes, it has a sense of balance, but it is not a great sense of balance. And in all of these cases, I use as my criteria, it has to be very easily understood, so much so that I always say, could I explain variety to a third grader with this picture? Somebody who's not very, very visually experienced. So, that's always my criteria. So it has balance, but it is not easy to understand as balance to a third grader. But as variety, go, oh, look, there's different, pyramids. So that's variety, okay? Don't go back and forth. They just click to the right. Okay, so now here's another question. Why did the photographer take this picture? And I would say it's because you have all of these poplar trees lined up, and you get this sense of what? Repetition. This is about repetition. Yeah, there's some other design principles in here, maybe variety, but it's not a great example of variety because all of the trees blend together. But you get a sense of the repetition of the trunks of the trees. So it's a good example of repetition. Not a great example, but a good example. All right, so this is Ansel Adams. And here's again a question. Why did Ansel Adams take this picture? Well, it's because of the light is hitting that one aspen tree. And so that becomes the principle of emphasis. That one tree is emphasized. And yes, there's repetition in the other aspens behind it, but it's not a great example of repetition or variety, but it's a great example of emphasis. So I could explain emphasis to a third grader with this. You also notice that the aspen tree is approximately in the composition we call the rule of thirds. So it's approximately at the 1/3 vertical rather than centered in the picture. So the rule of thirds is a really good compositional tool. All right, so now this one is Margaret Bourke-White. This is Buchenwald, prisoner of war camp. This was taken the day the Allied forces liberated the German prisoner of war camp. And I think this is a really good example of variety. Here's all these men, and they're all similar in the sense that they're all men, they're all prisoners, and now, there's that variation on a theme, so that makes variety. Here's another example, Margaret Bourke-White. This was photographed in Kentucky. Her point is that juxtaposition between the white family in the car and the black family lined up to get, I I think they're getting some food supplies because of it was a flood. But it's a good example of variety. Here again, like the prisoners, there's this, variation on a theme. This is another Margaret Bourke-White photograph. This was taken at the Peck Dam in Washington. This is actually the first cover of Life magazine. And you can see that this is an enormous structure, because in the center at the bottom there, right around there, those are people. So that tells you the scale of the object. It's huge. And so this is a good example of repetition. It's the same form that's repeated. Okay. This is Harry Callahan, a Chicago photographer. And then, this is a photograph, a portrait he did of his wife. And it's a good example of economy. The question of economy is how little can you show and pull off the image. So this is a good example of economy. This is another Harry Callahan photo. If you look at the bottom edge, that clues you into what we're looking at. This is in Chicago. This is Lake Michigan. And you can see at the bottom edge the shoreline as Lake Michigan kind of rolls in. So you have almost nothing in the photograph, so that's a pretty good example of economy. You do have some rhythm in the waves, but again, it's not something that I could explain rhythm to a third grader, but it's a good example of economy. Okay, here's another Harry Callahan photograph, also in Chicago. That's Lake Michigan in the background and snow. And you ask yourself, why did the photographer take this picture? Well, because the trees are all similar and different, but that makes it variety. It's a good example of variety. It's very, very simple. It has a certain amount of balance to it, but again, none of those other principles are easy to explain to a third grader. This is Imogene Cunningham, and these are fennel bulbs. So I would call this a good example of balance, for sure, and variety. It's a good example of variety. And you'll notice also that, again, the fennel bulbs are lined up about the 1/3 horizontal plane, and then they're divided to be the 1/3 across the vertical plane. So it's really an interesting composition using the rule of thirds. This is Tina Mondati. The title of this photo is Campesinos, which is Spanish for farmers. And so you can see all of the farmers' hats, those typical Mexican hats. And, so this is a great example of variety. And I think this is also a good example of, if we would shoot this picture in color, it would be much more distracting, their different colored clothing. The hats would all be made of straw, so they'd be similarly colored, but their clothing would be very distracting. So I think this is a good example of how black and white would work better, but I'm sure she shot this in black and white. So this is, again, Margaret Bourke-White. It's called Contour Plowing. It's photographed in California. And I think this is one of my favorite examples for rhythm. Rhythm is very difficult for people to create an example of, because in order to have rhythm, you need to have a certain amount of repetition, but you can have repetition without rhythm. Rhythm starts to become that musical harmonious syncopation in order to have rhythm. And you can see this is an extraordinarily huge area, because on the right side there you can see that those are tractors they're plowing this field. So these are tiny little things. We're looking at an enormous stretch of ground here. So a great example for rhythm. Okay, very easy to understand example of balance. Okay, very, very simple. I don't know who did this, but this is another perfect example for how to analyze a picture. So this, I believe, is in Los Angeles at the shipyards. And, you have to ask yourself, why did the photographer compose the image the way they did? And because this is a long line of cargo containers, and they could have photographed it anywhere, but here it is. The person chose to put the black container essentially at the 1/3 parallel mark, the rule of thirds, and all of the other containers are light toned. So I think the photographer was very intentionally trying to emphasize that one, but it definitely has a sense of balance. It definitely has a sense of variety, but I think when you put that one black one in there, especially where it is, like Ansel Adams' aspen tree, the photographer was really working on emphasis. So, it's not like a photograph can only have one principle of design. They can have multiple principles, but this one is a really, really good example of emphasis, but it also has, as I said, variety and also a sense of balance. Okay. I have no idea who this photograph is by, but this is unmistakably one design principle you can't escape from: emphasis. The way the light is just literally pointing to the one. This is in a factory. I believe this is in a steel mill, but I don't know exactly when. It's a historic photograph. So emphasis. Again, another very easy to understand image: balance. It's very symmetrically balanced. You don't have to have balance to be symmetrical, but it's very easy to explain it to a third grader if it's symmetrically balanced. Okay, and this is our final image. This is Ansel Adams. This is a very famous photograph, Moonrise over Hernandez, and I just think it's really interesting. I think this is an example of it's often difficult to define the principle of design here. But the moon is definitely emphasized. I mean, I think you really seen the moon, and I know that's why you took the picture. All right, so just to reiterate, there's 6 principles of design, right? You've got balance, emphasis, repetition. Oh, we didn't really talk about any repetition examples here. Yeah, repetition is the repeated thing. I think we're going to pause here so I can pull up a repetition picture. All right, so we're back again, and we had to dig up some examples of repetition since we didn't have any. So this is a pretty good example of repetition, and it definitely has emphasis with the dog, and I think it's got that visual sense of humor. Go to the next one. All right, now here's a good example of repetition also. I don't know where this is. I think it's in Asia someplace, but it's a really great picture of the repeating arches. It's a very good example of use of color also. Next. Okay, let's zoom back on this if we can. All right, we'll have to stay it like this. So this is the Flatiron Building in New York City, a really famous building. So I think this is a really good example of economy. And again, you'll look at the way it's positioned there. It's about the 1/3 plane on the vertical. So let's zoom back on this if we can. No, okay, we can't zoom back. So this is a pretty good example of variety. So here's all these beer samplers. And again, this is a student photograph, so not bad for variety. This is, again, Steve McCurry. This is Australia. I don't know the name of the river, but this is an incredibly rhythmic river and a beautiful photograph. And again, one more example of repetition and emphasis with the dog. And a pretty easy to understand example of variety here. And a final example for rhythm, which was just photographed on the campus with the bike racks. So I just want to reemphasize that we're talking the 6 principles of design. Our final still assignment will be the principles of design. You'll have to submit 6 images, and that'll be balance, emphasis, economy, rhythm, repetition, and variety. One of each will be our final still image assignment. So you can keep your eyes peeled for good examples. At this point, we're going to sign off. Thank you very much, and we'll catch you on the flip-flop.